coast, the trees, crows, redwings, and stuff.
It's like a vulture
Was it?
makes.
Okay.
Turkey vultures.
Yeah. Yep, yeah.
Are we good? Can you hear us? Can you hear me now?
We'll probably be talking. Is that good?
House is lighting.
All right. Well, I guess we'll get started talking about the surgeons, surgeons that were in the field, that were here at Gettysburg, and what we had to do. We'll start out briefly by giving you an idea of how the two medical departments were set up. Let me start off by saying I'm a Confederate surgeon. This is a federal surgeon, and by the end of the battle, we will be working together. Both sides had similar systems of how our field surgeons were set up, and they were basically set up by the regiment, and there were 10 companies of men in a regiment, and there were supposed to be so many men in a company, and we'll say by the time of Gettysburg there were probably between 300 and 500 men in the regiment. So our companies were smaller than what the regulations said. They were supposed to be 1,000 men, but very few regiments were that size. Excuse me, 100 men in a company. Very few regiments or companies were that size when they were here. So we're talking about a regiment of about 300 to 500 men. We have two surgeons. We have a chief surgeon, who in the Confederacy is equivalent to a major's rank, and an assistant surgeon who is equivalent to a captain's rank. And in the Federal Army, it's very similar.
Very similar. We would have a chief operating surgeon who is a major or a captain, and an assistant surgeon who is a captain or a lieutenant. So very similar rankings.
Our lower ranking surgeon would be the one that goes with the regiment when they go into battle. And he'll set up an aid station a few hundred yards back from the fighting. Probably someplace that will give him some cover, a ravine. We know of some men that were behind some of the barns, not in the barns, behind the barns themselves, so they had 2 or 3 walls of stone that gave their wounded and themselves some protection when they were close to the fighting. It's their job to stabilize the wounded man, get them on an ambulance, which is going to be a horse or mule-drawn wagon that's going to take them to a field hospital where the surgeons will be working. Early in this battle, they're in different locations. And when you go throughout the battlefield, you'll see the signs that are either blue or gray that tells you where a lot of these field hospitals were. Eventually, the way the system was set up, from the field hospital, they would be evacuated to general hospitals in the big cities, both north and south. That's where we did things a little bit different.
As far as getting our wounded to those general hospitals, in the Union, since I hesitate to say we were better supplied, we would actually have either hospital ship, because we had the waterways available to us, or a hospital train with cars that were dedicated for wounded soldiers. And in the Confederacy, they had
Mostly used the rail system.
trains.
Right, because the brown water, even when we were back in Virginia, was still pretty much occupied by the Federal Navy. So we utilized the railroad as much as possible. We also took it a step further and had a core hospital system that was like a mobile hospital that had their own staff, their own transportation, that was between the field hospital and the general hospital, and the transportation to get them to the general hospital. So we took it a step further with this kind of mobile hospital because we didn't have the staff and the waterways and such open. But while we're here in Gettysburg, we can't really get our men to general hospitals until we get back to Virginia. So even on the first and second day with the wounded, we were already evacuating them back down into Virginia, and we couldn't utilize the railroad until we got into Stanton. And of course, after the battle, you hear about the 17-mile long wagon train with wounded going back to Virginia, but also we had to leave about 6,000 wounded behind that were too severely wounded. And then of course, Camp Letterman was set up, and most of the Federals stayed here.
Right.
So we'll talk about, we talked about how we're supposed to evacuate, get them off the field, get them to a field hospital, and that's where we'll take off now with here at Gettysburg, where we've gotten the men off the field, they've been stabilized, and now they've been taken to a field hospital.
All kinds of different possibilities for field hospitals. Have a nice house here that we can requisition as a hospital. Most of the buildings in town ended up becoming a field hospital of some sorts. When you have a nice, secure structure such as this, even though the battle is in essence over, now we have all these wounded that we need to tend to. Here's a good place to do it. You know, if it rains, we're okay. We have dry conditions here. And in Camp Letterman, as we mentioned, once the regimental field hospitals had closed down or consolidated, we had our hospital tents, which were in a very good location under some nice trees, which provided some shade. With trees, we always have nice breeze. And the tents provided a good environment also.
Ventilation was important for the hospitals. So having the tents, to be able to open them up and get good ventilation. But here at the field hospital, the reason what we were dealing with mostly were, again, the evacuation of getting the wounded off the field. Most of what we could save the lives of were the men that came in from the field that had the shattered arms and legs. If it was a wound, a penetrating wound to the head, the chest, the stomach, or intestine, many of those wounds to the penetrating wounds to the head and chest may not even make it to the field hospital. But those with wounds to the stomach and the intestine would probably linger, so we would make them as comfortable as possible. But when the wounded came into those field hospitals, they were seen first by a sorting surgeon, and he was going to take the men that we knew we could save first, and those would be the surgical cases. And most of them were the wounds to the arms and the legs, the shattered bones or the damaged arteries or both. We knew if we did amputations, we could probably save their lives. The reason for that was, the reason for so much damage was the bullet, the mini ball. The only reason it's called a mini ball was the name of the Frenchman who designed it. It's actually a huge lead bullet, and when it hit bone, it would shatter bone, flatten out like this, shatter bone, soft tissue damage. It was so big, it would bring pieces of the uniform in with it, and it was also lubricated with animal fat. And you can imagine what might be on our uniforms. So this was going to be a nasty infection. Antibiotics are 80 years into the future. That's World War II era. So we have no antibiotics to deal with the infection. Basically everything gets infected. And we have another problem.
Of course, we don't understand about bacteria. The germ theory isn't developed yet. So those of you sitting here know, like before you have lunch or supper, your parents probably tell you to go wash your hands. Why? Because you're cleaning up the germs that are on there. Surgeons of the day don't know about those germs. So why would they need to take care of something like that if they don't know that it's there? The germ theory isn't here yet, so we don't know about that.
So many of the doctors after the war mentioned that they were clean socially, that they understood filth led to disease, and that they would wash the visible dirt away. But no, nothing was sterile. We would use our finger to probe wounds, and then we would probe another wound with our finger to see how serious it was. We didn't understand that germ theory. So if we do nothing to the damage that's done to an arm or a leg from this bullet, that's going to fester into a deep infection, get into the bloodstream, and would kill the soldier. So we're going to take that damaged area away. But once again, we're going to use our dirty fingers and unsterile instruments, so we're going to create an infection also. The difference is we've changed that infection to a surface infection, and we allow that to drain from the body, so that's how we can save so many lives.
As opposed to that deep one, which is going to just wreak all kinds of havoc. Not only that, we don't know what that patient has been through from the time he was wounded until he got to us. With the amputation, he is absolutely correct that we are going to create a new wound also, but it's one that we have control, and we know what's going on with it. We've monitored it as it's progressing, so we can tend to that.
When we do our surgeries, the surgeons, again, will refer to them, those that wrote about it after the war, this is on both sides, said that 97% of the surgeries that were done with some sort of anesthesia, either chloroform or ether. So the majority of the surgeries that were done with insensibility to the patient, so they weren't feeling the pain when we were doing this. There were times of shortages, and then what one surgeon wrote is during times of shortages, he was a Confederate surgeon, he said they would save the chloroform and use it for the larger operations, but the little ones hurt just as bad.
Fortunately for the Union Medical Department, pretty well supplied, but of course the Confederacy didn't have blockades against our supplies. The Union had them against the Confederacy, so theirs became more limited.
You want to talk about chloroform and ether?
We can talk about the two anesthetics that we have available are chloroform and ether. Ether was discovered in 1841, so by the time the war came about, it was widely used. It was used for 21 years, so it was widely used. A physician in Georgia,
Yeah.
you said.
Crawford Long in Georgia was one of the first to use ether. As a matter of fact, ether was a recreational drug, and he was invited to an ether frolic where he saw people cavorting or doing some crazy stuff and they weren't feeling any pain, and he said, maybe I can use this. So,
Opportunity.
yes.
The other option, one of the bad parts of ether is it's very flammable, and if we have a house like this that we've requisitioned, oftentimes there's a fireplace inside, the fumes are heavier than air, they will congregate on the floor and migrate towards the heat source as it's rotating through. So what happens is once enough of those fumes get to the fireplace, what happens? Boom. Either that or we're operating by lanterns,
Oil lamps.
or oil
Candlelight.
lamps, candlelight, and it's not uncommon that your surgeon's smoking a cigar over you as he's operating too. So if somebody lights a cigar or a lantern and the ember isn't completely out and it drops to the floor, could be enough to set it off. Fortunately, chloroform is not flammable, but each of the anesthetics has its own pros and cons. So with that, delivery, Union versus Confederate, is a little different. In the Union, we had a nice implement called an ether cone. Just basically a funnel with either a sponge or a cloth on the top, goes over the mouth and nose. A few drops go inside here. Confederacy could use a
sponge,
a
or we
cloth,
would sometimes make
like
a
a
cone
mask.
out of cloth and place it over the face that way. It appears because of the how volatile ether was, and because it's almost a constant drip to keep the patient under, you have to carry more of it. The Confederacy appears that they preferred the chloroform and actually had some depots in the South where they were producing certain things like sulfuric acid, and they were able to produce some chloroform. I just don't know how much they were able to produce and how often they were able to use what they produced. But they used it so that they could, with a cone, or there was actually an inhaler that was produced by Dr. Chisholm. It was to save chloroform because it was so precious. It had actually two tubes that went up the nose and a little bowl with a piece of sponge where you could just drip a little bit of chloroform on that, and you had a lot less waste up into the nose. It was used more with chloroform. It was more of a sedation, like a twilight, than an actual anesthesia like you would think of today. Many men remembered their surgery, but they remember they didn't feel anything. And that's the case with Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville when he was wounded by friendly fire and he had to have his left arm amputated. Of course, Chancellorsville was before Gettysburg. As he was being administered the chloroform by Dr. McGuire, he said, "What an infinite blessing." He wasn't feeling pain anymore. He repeated blessing over and over until he was insensible. And then the next day after the surgery, he tells Dr. McGuire the sound of the saw was the sweetest music he ever heard. So he remembered his surgery, but he remembered he didn't feel anything.
Definitely a benefit. One of the biggest benefits that Civil War medicine has over Revolutionary War medicine is we do have our anesthesia available.
Anything in particular? We didn't really talk about the identification on the field or anything like that. Right?
One of the nice things of being a Civil War surgeon is, we are considered non-combatants, which that's a good thing, but it's not the nice thing, but it's a kind of an added benefit. Both myself and my Confederate counterpart here have similar hats. Oftentimes Confederate surgeons will wear a straw hat or whatever because it's cooler, but we both have the same emblem on our hat with the MS on it. Stands for medical service, medical staff, whatever you want to consider it. Also stands for
Mustn't shoot.
Mustn't shoot. After one of the battles of Winchester, Stonewall Jackson and Phil Sheridan came together on a flag of truce. I believe it was Sheridan, and they needed to work some things out. First off, they said our medical departments need to be left alone so they can do their jobs. And so from that time on, we were considered non-combatants and offhands. Now granted, if you're a distance away, you're not going to see that this says MS. It might look like US or whatever. But one of the other things that we have oftentimes, since we are both officers, we would have a sash on. And in the medical department, our sash color is green. So if you're quite a distance away, you'd still see my green sash. So that will designate us as surgeons, therefore non-combatants, therefore don't try and capture me. Or shoot me anyhow. Mustn't shoot.
And then many times, as here at Gettysburg, about 100 Confederate surgeons were left behind because we left behind 6,000 severely wounded that couldn't be transported. So many times these surgeons work together, and it happens here and other places. To be a surgeon, you had to be an MD. You had to go to medical school. The medical school was 2 years, and it was very little hands-on experience. Most of it was lectures, and that's how the professors were paid, by selling lecture tickets. But you graduated, you had to be an MD, and then to become an Army surgeon, whether it was an assistant surgeon or then eventually a full surgeon, you had to take a board of examinations with both armies were the same way.
And the entrance exams were all essays. Interesting enough, one of the questions on the Union side, I know, always pertained to female anatomy. And you might think to yourself, why is that? But there's always generals' wives or somebody, ladies' aid societies, somebody in the camp that is of a female nature, and you never know what's going to happen. So depending on how thoroughly you answered your essay questions would dictate whether you passed or not, and the degree of which you would. So the more thorough you were, the better your chance of passing and them understanding that you really do know what you're talking about.
So what after Gettysburg, you said it was not enough for surgeons, and they released them after that battle was over?
100 surgeons.
100, were they ever come back? Or?
Actually, this is the one time where the system was broke down for a short period of time. They were considered non-combatants, and typically when they were left behind, either Federal on Confederate, Confederate on Federal, they were exchanged after their work was done. Their work here, it appears that it was about 6 weeks that the Confederate surgeons stayed behind. What happens during that time period is, as I said, one of the rare times throughout the war where something occurred and they were actually held longer because there was a federal surgeon named Rucker that was from Virginia originally before the war. He was wanted in Virginia before the war for murder and horse thievery. And I think the horse thievery was probably the worst of the two defenses. He was captured in Virginia. I'm not sure exactly, where, Winchester or what, but they recognized him and they were going to try him for the horse thievery and murder. And the federals said, you can't do that because he's a surgeon. And it's like, we're not trying him because he's a surgeon, we're trying him because of these charges against him. And so they stopped the exchange of Confederates during that time. Rucker finally escapes, and the whole thing falls apart, and it isn't until October of 1863 that the rest of these surgeons, Confederate surgeons, go back to their regiments. From what I understand, they were at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and Baltimore was very pro-Confederate. And while these surgeons were there, many of the ladies of the town were bringing them cookies and delicacies, and they weren't really being held like prisoners. It sounds like many of them just kind of wandered away. But Simon Baruch was at Black Horse Tavern. He was a Confederate surgeon that was left behind, and he basically stayed there the whole time. He was concerned. He didn't want to just walk away. So he got back to his regiment, or got back in October of '63. So it was one of the few times that there was the system kind of fell apart.
They're about to shut them to take care of the problems for the next battle.
Well, they would have brought somebody else up into their place, because again, we only had the 2 surgeons, and most of them left behind, like Simon, they were assistant surgeons. But this brings us to a great place. As we were talking about, 6,000 were too severely wounded to travel, and then of course there was that 17-mile wagon train of wounded going back to Virginia on the 5th. The federal surgeons were still here, but they move on the 6th because they're thinking, okay, there might be another battle. So Jonathan Letterman, the medical director for the Army of Potomac, the Federals, he has to move his army on. He has to leave, so he leaves 106 surgeons behind. And the 100 number of Confederates is kind of I think a guess. It actually was Baruch that mentions in his diary about 100 surgeons and then a number of chaplains that were left behind. So let's say we have 100 Confederates and 106 Federals. We have 206 surgeons, and we have the 6,000 wounded Confederate, and we have 16,000 or 18,000 or whatever wounded Federals. So you've got about 25,000 wounded men. You've got a town of about 2,400, so you've got about a 10-to-1 ratio for every person that lives in Gettysburg. There's 10 people left, 10 wounded people here. You have 200 surgeons. You've got, by the end of the week, near 12,000 dead, 3,000 dead animals. So it's a terrible crisis in the area. There was a Confederate surgeon named, Stewart John Apperson, that was the 2nd Corps Hospital. On July 3rd, his surgeon said, find us fresh water, we need fresh water. And he had a terrible time trying to find fresh water. We know Plum Run was called Bloody Run. And,
when did they come after this?
Before.
Antietam's before. Where should we head?
We forgot to go.
Amputations are the most common procedure that surgeons are performing. Typical amputation takes about 10 minutes. Fortunately for us, our anesthesia is going to last about 10 to 12 minutes or so. So works out fairly well. Again, with going to medical school and not having a lot of hands-on experience, surgeons are getting a lot of hands-on medicine now because there's so many wounded coming into the field hospitals. Those of you in the audience here, how many of you play a musical instrument? Anybody? What do you play?
I used to play the trombone.
Trombone. How do you get good at playing your musical instrument? You have to practice. Same thing with our medicine. We have to practice our medicine. When we got to, he had mentioned about the regimental size, when we get to the brigade size of the field hospital where we have more surgeons available, you can have actually our sorting surgeon dictating, he's assessing a wounded coming in. He's going to dictate, okay, this is a wounded leg. It's going to go to table 1 where we have surgeons that are doing leg amputations. This is an arm wound coming in. It's going to go to table 2 where we have surgeons doing only arms. So these surgeons that are doing these procedures are almost like specializing in arms or legs at that early stage of the game. When you do something over and over again, you get very good at it and very efficient. And that's how they become a good surgeon, is that practice.
We got plenty of that.
And we got plenty of that, yes. After we've done our procedure, you want to talk about some tools here?
Yeah, we can do that.
Different types of initial cuts that we need to make to remove the limb. We can use a long knife, depending on what part of the body. If it's a single bone limb or a double bone limb, we use either a Lister knife or a Catlin knife.
Catlin knife having a double-edged blade so you can cut between the bones.
In essence, saving you time. So you don't have to take your Lister knife in, cut part way, take it out, and turn it around.
Because you don't want to use a saw on any of the soft tissue. It's just,
No.
yeah, so that's why we would cut tissue between them. Of course, first we would use the chloroform or ether, render the patient insensible. We would put a tourniquet of pettit, different than a field tourniquet, although all of our tourniquets have a pad for the major artery, so we're not just cutting circulation off, we're controlling the blood flow. This would come around, tighten up, and then we have a key so we can control that blood flow and basically turn it off as much as possible while the cutting is happening. So using the knives on the soft tissue, and then when we get to the large vessels,
we can use a tool called a tenaculum. Oftentimes, when surgeons know there's a number of wounded coming in, they can actually have a ligature, several of them loosely wrapped around here, because they'll pull out the vessels, pull that ligature down, tie it off, get the next vessel. Instead of having to take one, put it on there, loop it around, you can have several lined up, ready to go. So then we would pull those vessels out, tie them off, let the end of the ligature long so it can hang out the bottom of the stump. And we're not going to completely close the stump just yet. We want it to heal from the inside out, so we'll let it open some and it will drain. As the tissue is healing and drying, it's going to contract around itself. And we didn't mention the different types of cuts we can make. There's basically 3 of them. One is like a guillotine or a circular. It's just like basically straight around. It's quick. It's not a nice finished product, but it's quick and it saves time.
and it can be done by somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience.
Exactly.
Early war.
So early war, and as time goes on, we get more efficient at doing these things. So with experience, you get better. There's an elliptical cut, which goes kind of like that around the limb, which offers somewhat of a flap. So we'll pull up. This is real good for an amputation at the ankle. So you can flip that down for the heel part. And then the third one is, it's like a bird's mouth where you can cut this way, so you get 2 flaps and they will close together nicely. That takes a lot more time, it's a lot more involved, but it does a much nicer job. And again, with experience and time, a good surgeon can amputate a leg at the hip in 7 minutes. But that takes experience to get to that point. So we've done our flaps. Depending on personal preference, my counterpart here, John, likes to pull out the vessels before the rest of the tissue is all cut, so he can, in essence, mark where they're at, whereas other surgeon would just sever the flesh, cut the bone, or retract the flesh back up, cut the bone. Then you have to find those vessels. Now, there's still going to be seeping some, so that's not really impossible, right? It's certainly doable, but if you hook it first, then you kind of know where it's at, and you don't have to go in search of it. Once we're done with that, we're going to pack the wound with some lint material.
Gotta use the saw.
Oh, didn't we mention that?
We didn't mention
All
the
right.
saw.
I said retract flesh back. Okay. So after we'll back up there. So we've cut the flesh, we've hooked our vessels, we track the flesh back, and this is the assistant surgeon that's doing this now. The surgeon's actually going to be taking the saw, cutting the bones. Then we can like let the flesh back down, let the ligatures hanging out. We're going to pack the wound with some dressings, some lint, tack it shut with a couple stitches just to keep it from coming wide open. Bandage it up. Now, on the Confederacy side, with less staff available, they would tend to put their bandages on a little bit looser, knowing that they're not going to get changed quite as frequently. Where on the Union side, we had more staff. And keep in mind, too, that a great benefit to both departments are the Ladies' Aid Societies, Sanitation Commission, Christian Commission, those sorts of things that are available. Religious Sisters down the road 12 miles in Emmitsburg, where they had the Daughters of Charity, were a nursing order. They were actually the preferred nursing staff here at the surgeons on both sides because they know how to nurse. They've actually been trained to do that. At the time of the war, there are no nursing schools in the United States. So anybody that was officially trained as a nurse was an immigrant from Europe, where there were nursing schools. So these religious sisters are definitely a preferred nursing personnel. One, they know what they're doing, and two, and more important maybe, is their vows of obedience. If a surgeon tells a daughter of charity, can you launder these bandages and dress these wounds, quite capable of doing that. Where if we have a Ladies' Aid Society from town that has their nice gown on, which really there's no need for a hoop in particular in a camp, they might not want to get their gown all soiled. So they might not want to do that quite as readily. Although then we had Ma Bitterdijk, and I won't even get into her. So we can bandage the wounds up, revive our patient, move him to recovery.
Well, when we remove the tourniquet of pettit, again, being a screw tourniquet, having control over the blood flow, as we were mentioning about tying off the vessels, if we didn't do a good job and we just use a regular field tourniquet and it's either on or off, if we just took it off and we didn't do a very good job and now we have bleeding happening, we could have a problem trying to go back after those vessels. So with a screw tourniquet, once again, now we can open it up slowly and let the blood pressure on slowly instead of the blood pressure hitting all at one time, and make sure that we've tied it off properly. And then along with what we mentioned about those sutures, those ligatures, those long strings of the suture, they also help as a drain. It also kind of gives a path, because what we want to do, what we're going to look for after we do an amputation in a day or so, is what we call laudable pus. It's the kind of the frothy pus. Not necessarily saying it would be a good thing to see today, but it was what was expected, the direction that was expected at the time. If it went bad and it smelled bad and it was running brown, that was considered septic because it smelled bad. So we had things that were antiseptics. Even though we didn't understand the germ theory, we had antiseptics. And what we had is something that we use as a deodorizer, things like bromine, carbolic acid, iodine, turpentine, things that are caustic enough that they're killing bacteria that's deteriorating the flesh, that's making it smell bad. But because we don't know the germ theory, we don't understand the bacteria, so what we're doing is we're using it as a deodorizer. So we never got the horse before the cart. We were actually doing the right thing. It's just that it was never done until it was a problem. Did that make sense?
Yes, it did. Put 2 and 2 together, but it didn't necessarily come up to 4.
Anyway, is there something else? Is there any questions? Someplace else we need to go?
Medicines.
Sure, absolutely.
Beforehand, keep in mind that when a soldier is wounded out, they'll end up at a field dressing station where we have our assistant surgeon and a hospital steward, have a knapsack with some medicine, bandages, and so on. One of the medicines that we would have, most likely, would be our Pilule Opi. For those of you that can't speak Latin, opium pills. Opium is very good for pain. would administer a dose once the surgeon assesses that wound, transport him back to the field hospital. He would give him a dose of this before he got there. When he gets back to the field hospital, then our sorting surgeon is going to reassess that wound again, keeping in mind each time this wound is assessed, what's going to happen. These nice clean fingers are going to go into that wound, okay, to see what's going on. So he's going to get another dose of opium, probably, by our sorting surgeon. Then he ends up on our operating table. Guess what's going to happen again? Into the wound. Now it's already happened, what, 3, 4, 5 times. People are sticking their finger in your wounded limb. Once we're done with that, our patient is revived. We're going to either give him a liquid form of opium. How many of you folks have ever heard of laudanum? Anybody? Laudanum is basically opium dissolved in alcohol. In our Latin version, it would be a tinctura opii, a tincture of opium. And again, something you could drink. A lot of times back in the day, postpartum women would be prescribed laudanum for their postpartum depression. It's basically your make you happy drug. So once we recover our patient, if he can't swallow a tablet, we'll give him a drink of opium. Move him off our table to our recovery area where we're going to have hopefully another either hospital steward or an assistant surgeon there also to check on things. Again, in the union or the federal medical department, we have more staff there, so we can hopefully have that available. But there's going to be somebody else that will tend to him, you know, bandage the wound more thoroughly, give some more opium, and our pain tolerance, it's an individual basis. If John and myself each had the same wound, he might only need 3 opium pills, I might need 7. It's not necessarily because I'm bigger than he is, maybe it's just because my pain tolerance is much lower. And we are administering not based on size, it's based on our patient's response and what they're telling us. Our goal is to keep our patients comfortable. Now again, there's that fine line between comfort and addiction, and how do we assess that? You know, we want them to be functional, but when you become addicted, you're really no longer functional. Well, you could be, but that's that fine line. And hopefully by that time, our patient that we are tending to this wound, the wound is healed and he has moved, either to a general hospital or back home. And in essence, he's somebody else's, I hesitate to say, someone else's problem now to deal with that. So, any questions? We do have opium in 5 different varieties in our pannier. 2 different types of tablets and 3 liquids. So we do keep our patients quite comfortable as best we can.
And keep in mind, morphine sulfate is also available during this time period, which is still the gold standard of treating pain today. Just in most cases, it's something that the military is not going to have, because it's too expensive.
Right. Questions, folks?
Nothing?
Nothing?
Thank you.
Well, thank you for attending and offering your attention. Thank you. You too. Good job again.
We got sidetracked with different things.
Yeah.